Most people spend their entire lives being slaves to their emotions, reacting impulsively to every trigger, every disappointment, every frustration. But what if I told you that 2,000 years ago, the most powerful man in the world discovered a method to completely master his emotional responses? Marcus Aurelius, the Roman emperor who faced plagues, wars, and betrayals, left us a 21-day system that can transform you from an emotional reactor into a calm, controlled leader of your own mind. This isn't about suppressing feelings. It's about understanding the ancient Stoic principles that separate those who control their destiny from those who are controlled by their circumstances. Subscribe to the channel, leave your like and comment from what part of the world you're watching, because now I'm going to tell you everything. Have you ever had that feeling of waking up and before even looking at your phone, already feeling that weight in your chest? That vague sense of dread about the day ahead. And then, sure enough, something happens. A critical email, a rude comment, traffic, and your entire emotional state gets hijacked for hours afterward. You're not alone. In fact, this is the default human condition, what I call our invisible emotional prison. We spend roughly 70% of our waking hours in a reactive mode, not actually choosing our responses to life, but rather being driven by automatic emotional reactions that feel completely out of our control. Think about your day yesterday. How many times did something external, a notification, a comment, a news headline, instantly change your emotional state? And how long did that emotional shift last compared to the trigger itself? This is the bizarre math of emotional reactivity. A 30-second interaction can hijack your mental state for 3 hours afterward. Neuroscience helps explain why. When you experience something your brain perceives as threatening, even just a critical email, your amygdala, the brain's alarm system, activates before your rational mind has any say in the matter. Blood literally flows away from your prefrontal cortex, your thinking brain, and toward your limbs, preparing you for fight or flight. This was great for our ancestors facing predators, but it's terrible for navigating modern life. But here's what fascinated me when I first discovered Stoicism. The most powerful man in the ancient world struggled with exactly the same problem. Marcus Aurelius, emperor of Rome, commanding vast armies and ruling an empire of 120 million people, wrote in his private journal about how he would get annoyed by rude people, worried about others' opinions, and anxious about the future. These weren't philosophical musings written for publication. They were private notes to himself, reminders of how to stay centered amid the emotional challenges of daily life. In one particularly revealing passage, he writes to himself, "When you wake up in the morning, tell yourself, the people I deal with today will be meddling, ungrateful, arrogant, dishonest, jealous, and surly." This wasn't pessimism. It was emotional preparation. Marcus understood something profound that most of us miss. It's not the events themselves that disturb our peace of mind, but our interpretations of those events. This insight is so crucial. I want you to pause and really let it sink in. It's not what happens to you that determines your emotional state, but what you tell yourself about what happens. Need proof? Consider how different people can have completely opposite reactions to the identical situation. One person gets cut off in traffic and flies into a rage that ruins their morning. Another person gets cut off and thinks that person must be having a rough day and forgets about it 30 seconds later. Same external event, radically different emotional experiences. I want you to try something right now. Take 10 seconds to identify a recent situation where you reacted automatically. Maybe you got defensive about feedback, stressed about a deadline, or irritated by someone's behavior. Got it? Now ask yourself, what was the interpretation that created my emotional reaction? What story did I tell myself about what was happening? This simple awareness is the first crack in the prison wall, because once you see that it's your interpretation creating the emotion, not the event itself, you gain the first glimpse of freedom. But here's where most of us go wrong. We spend enormous energy trying to control external events while neglecting the one thing we actually can control: our responses to those events. We try to control other people's behavior, the weather, the economy, the past, all things completely beyond our influence, while failing to master our own reactions. This futile approach was exactly what the Stoic philosophers identified as the root cause of human suffering over 2,000 years ago, and their solution was revolutionary. Focus exclusively on what you can control and accept with equanimity what you cannot. But how do we actually do this in practice? How do we break the automatic chain reaction between stimulus and response? The Stoics discovered something crucial. There is always a space, however tiny, between what happens to us and how we respond. In that space lies our freedom and power. Modern psychologists call this the stimulus-response gap, but the Stoics were practicing this millennia ago. Let me teach you a simple technique I call the 3-second interval that can change everything in a stressful situation. The next time something triggers you emotionally, criticism, disappointment, frustration, consciously pause for just 3 seconds before responding. During those 3 seconds, take one deliberate breath and remind yourself that you have a choice in how to respond. Just 3 seconds. It sounds trivial, but this tiny gap can prevent hours of emotional aftermath. I remember when I first tried this technique, I received an email that completely misrepresented my work on a project, copying several senior colleagues. My immediate reaction was a surge of defensive anger. But instead of firing back an immediate response, my usual reaction, I paused for those 3 seconds. I took a breath, and in that tiny space, I realized I had options beyond my automatic defensive reaction. I could respond thoughtfully rather than reactively. That small gap changed everything. Instead of creating a tense email chain that would have consumed emotional energy for days, I responded with clarity and addressed the misunderstanding directly. The situation was resolved in a single exchange, and I saved myself hours of emotional turmoil. Now, I want to be very clear about something important. Stoicism is not about suppressing emotions or becoming an unfeeling robot. This is perhaps the biggest misconception about Stoic philosophy. The goal is not to eliminate emotions. That would make us less human, not more. The true goal of Stoic practice is something far more nuanced and powerful: to experience emotions without being controlled by them. Think about the difference between these two scenarios. In the first, something happens. You react emotionally, and that emotion drives your behavior automatically. In the second, something happens. You feel the emotion, but you retain the ability to choose your response deliberately. Same emotion, completely different relationship to it. This is what I mean by emotional mastery. Not the absence of emotion, but the freedom to choose your response to it. Let me make a realistic promise about what the next 21 days can do for you. You won't eliminate negative emotions entirely, nor should you want to. Emotions like appropriate fear, sadness, and even anger serve important functions. But what will change is your relationship with these emotions. They will no longer control your behavior, hijack your day, or determine your well-being. Here's what that looks like in practice. When someone criticizes your work, you'll still feel that initial sting. But instead of becoming defensive or ruminating for hours, you'll be able to consider whether there's anything useful in the feedback and respond constructively. When plans change unexpectedly, you'll feel the initial disappointment, but quickly adapt rather than staying frustrated about what should have happened. When someone behaves rudely, you'll notice the irritation, but choose not to let it affect your peace of mind. This isn't just philosophical theory. It's practical, emotional freedom. And over the next 21 days, I'm going to show you exactly how to achieve it using time-tested Stoic practices updated for our modern world. But before we move forward, you need to understand the fundamental principle that changes everything. It's a distinction so simple it seems obvious when you hear it, but so powerful it can literally transform your experience of life the moment you apply it. I'm talking about the difference between what we can and cannot control, what the Stoics called the dichotomy of control. This single principle, properly understood and applied, eliminates an enormous amount of unnecessary suffering and redirects your energy toward what actually matters. Epictetus, who began his life as a slave yet achieved more inner freedom than most free men, opened his handbook of Stoic wisdom with this principle. He taught that some things are within our power, while others are not. Within our power are our judgments, our values, our responses, and our actions. Not within our power are our body, our reputation, our status, and everything else not of our own doing. This isn't just philosophical theory. It's a practical framework for emotional freedom that we'll explore in depth in the next chapter. Because once you truly understand what is and isn't under your control, you'll stop wasting emotional energy on things you cannot change and focus fully on what you actually can influence. And that shift alone can transform your entire experience of life. There's a principle that the slave Epictetus taught that made him mentally freer than his own master. It's a distinction so simple it seems obvious when you hear it, but so powerful it can literally transform your experience of life from the moment you apply it. It's about the crucial difference between what we can and what we cannot control. Have you ever noticed how we spend hours worrying about things we can't change? That promotion decision that's out of your hands, what people might be thinking about you, or the weather ruining your plans. It's exhausting, isn't it? This constant concern about things beyond our control is exactly what keeps us trapped in emotional turmoil. But there's a way out, and it starts with a principle so powerful that it allowed a man in chains to experience more freedom than the emperor who ruled him. The story of Epictetus is extraordinary when you really think about it. Born into slavery in ancient Rome, he lived his early life with virtually no external freedom. He couldn't choose where to go, what to do, or even what would happen to his own body. In fact, historical accounts suggest his master once cruelly twisted his leg until it broke, leaving him permanently disabled. Yet, despite these horrific external circumstances, Epictetus discovered something revolutionary. While his body was enslaved, his mind could remain free. How? Through what he called the most fundamental principle of his philosophy, which he expressed in the opening lines of his handbook. Some things are within our power, while others are not. Within our power are opinion, motivation, desire, aversion, and, in a word, whatever is of our own doing. Not within our power are our body, our property, reputation, office, and, in a word, whatever is not of our own doing. This insight, the dichotomy of control, is deceptively simple, yet when applied consistently, it's absolutely transformative. It's like an emotional sorting system that immediately tells you where to focus your energy and what to release. Let me make this visual for you. Imagine two circles, a smaller one inside a larger one. The inner circle contains everything you can control. The outer circle contains everything you can't control. Your job is to focus all your energy on the inner circle and practice accepting the outer circle with equanimity. What exactly is in your inner circle? Your judgments about situations, your own intentions, your responses to events, your decisions, your values, your goals, and your actions. These are things you have genuine control over. And what falls into the outer circle? The weather, traffic, other people's opinions, the economy, the past, most physical circumstances, and the outcomes of your efforts. You might influence some of these things, but you don't control them. Now let's try a quick experiment together. Think about something that's causing you stress right now. Got it? Great. Now ask yourself, is this something I can control completely? Or is it something I can at most influence, or perhaps have no control over at all? If it's something you can't control, like whether someone responds positively to your message or whether you get caught in traffic, notice how much emotional energy you're investing in something you cannot change. That's wasted energy. That's suffering without purpose. But if it's something you can control, like how you prepare for a meeting or how you respond to criticism, that's where your focus belongs. That's productive energy. I remember when I first applied this principle during a major project at work. We were facing significant delays that were outside my control. A vendor had missed deadlines, resources were unexpectedly cut, and the timeline was becoming impossible. I was lying awake at night, consumed with anxiety and frustration. Then I tried this stoic exercise. I took a piece of paper and drew 2 columns. In one column, I listed everything about the situation I couldn't control: the vendor's performance, decisions made by upper management, the compressed timeline, other team members' work quality. In the other column, I listed what I could control: my communication with stakeholders, how I prioritized the remaining work, my attitude toward the challenge, and how I supported my team. The effect was almost immediate. By consciously directing my attention away from all the factors I couldn't change and focusing exclusively on what I could control, my anxiety decreased dramatically. Not because the situation had changed, it hadn't, but because my relationship to it had transformed. This isn't positive thinking or wishful optimism. In fact, it's quite the opposite. The dichotomy of control is about radical acceptance of reality as it is, while directing your energy only toward what you can actually influence. It's the most practical approach to life's challenges I've ever encountered. Research in cognitive behavioral therapy confirms this approach. Studies show that when people distinguish between what they can and cannot control in anxiety-provoking situations, they experience up to a 43% reduction in anxiety symptoms after just 1 session. That's because much of our emotional suffering comes from trying to control the uncontrollable. Now I want you to pause for a moment and think about how this applies to your work life. When a project doesn't go as planned, what aspects are under your control? Your response, your adjustments, your communication, your next steps. What's not under your control? The past decisions, other people's mistakes, external constraints. What about in relationships? When someone doesn't respond to your message, what can you control? Your interpretation of their silence, your next message, your decision about how to proceed. What can't you control? Their response timeline, their feelings, their priorities. Consider health situations. If you're facing a health challenge, what's in your control? Your treatments, your lifestyle choices, your attitude toward the situation? What's not in your control? The diagnosis itself, your body's exact response to treatment, genetic factors. One critical mistake people make when applying this principle is confusing influence with control. Yes, you can influence many things in the outer circle through your actions. You can influence a relationship through your behavior. You can influence your health through your habits. You can influence a project's outcome through your efforts. But influence is not control. You can be the most caring partner and still not control how someone responds to you. You can make perfect health choices and still get sick. You can do excellent work and still have a project fail due to external factors. True emotional freedom comes from recognizing this distinction and releasing the expectation that influence should guarantee outcomes. You do your best in areas you can influence while accepting that the final results aren't entirely up to you. Let me show you a practical way to integrate this into your daily life. Each morning, spend 3 minutes creating 2 lists. First, write down everything that's concerning you today. Then, draw a line between what you can control and what you cannot. For the items you can control, circle them and make a brief plan for addressing them. For the items you cannot control, deliberately cross them out, saying to yourself, "This is not up to me. I release my concern about this." This simple practice, done consistently over 21 days, will rewire how your brain processes challenges. Rather than spinning in anxiety about the uncontrollable, you'll automatically sort situations and focus your energy where it can actually make a difference. I call this the mental sorting hat, a tool that immediately tells you where something belongs in your attention hierarchy. Is this something I can control? Yes. Then it deserves my full attention and energy. No. Then it deserves my acceptance, not my resistance. The promise of results here is significant. Starting tomorrow, if you apply this practice, you'll begin seeing stressful situations with a clarity you've never had before. You'll stop wasting emotional energy on things you cannot change, and you'll direct that energy toward what you actually can influence. This isn't just about feeling better, though you will. It's about becoming more effective. When you stop exhausting yourself, fighting against reality, or worrying about things beyond your control, you have much more energy available for constructive action. Imagine approaching a challenging conversation, not anxious about how the other person will respond, which you can't control, but focused entirely on communicating with clarity and kindness, which you can control. The conversation will go better simply because your energy isn't divided between what matters and what doesn't. Or imagine approaching a deadline focusing not on the limited time, which you can't change, but on how to prioritize effectively within that constraint, which you can control. You'll make better decisions because your thinking isn't clouded by resistance to reality. The beauty of this practice is that it becomes more natural with time. After consistently applying the dichotomy of control for 21 days, you'll find yourself automatically sorting situations into within my control and outside my control categories. This mental habit becomes a form of emotional protection, preventing unnecessary suffering before it begins. Remember that Marcus Aurelius himself needed constant reminders of this principle. In his journal, he repeatedly wrote variations of "Focus on what is in your power and accept what isn't." If the most powerful man in the world needed these reminders, we should expect to need them too. The dichotomy of control isn't a one-time realization, but a practice. Something you apply again and again until it becomes second nature. And each time you apply it, you strengthen your emotional resilience. Now, you might be thinking, but what about preparing for negative possibilities? Shouldn't I worry at least a little about things that could go wrong, even if I can't control them completely? This is a thoughtful question, and it leads us to another powerful Stoic practice. The Stoics didn't suggest ignoring potential challenges. In fact, they recommended quite the opposite, a systematic practice of anticipating difficulties. But they approached this anticipation in a unique way that avoided the trap of anxiety while preserving the benefits of preparedness. This technique, called premeditatio malorum, or premeditation of evils, is a structured way to mentally rehearse challenging scenarios not with worry, but with strategic foresight. Now that you know what you can and cannot control, you need to understand the tool that the Stoics used to deal with what they feared most. It's a technique that seems contradictory at first glance. They deliberately imagined the worst scenarios possible. Seneca, who was the wealthiest man in Rome, regularly practiced living as if he had lost everything. The result? An emotional immunity that transformed his greatest fear into his greatest strength. You know when you find yourself imagining all the bad things that might happen? That job interview where you stumble over your words, the presentation where your mind goes blank, or the awkward silence when your joke falls flat. Most of us spend a surprising amount of time mentally rehearsing worst-case scenarios. But what if I told you this tendency, which often feels like anxiety, could actually become your greatest source of emotional strength? This is where the Stoics offer us something counterintuitive, yet remarkably powerful. They developed a practice that seems to contradict everything modern positivity culture teaches us. While today's self-help gurus might tell you to visualize success and think positive thoughts, the Stoics recommended something radically different, deliberately visualizing the worst things that could happen. Seneca, who served as advisor to Emperor Nero, perhaps history's most volatile and dangerous boss, regularly practiced what the Stoics called premeditatio malorum, the premeditation of evils. Despite being one of the wealthiest men in Rome, Seneca would periodically set aside days to live as if he had lost everything. He would wear his shabbiest clothes, eat the plainest food, and sleep on the floor, telling himself, "Is this what I feared?" Why would someone voluntarily put themselves through discomfort? Because Seneca had discovered something profound about human psychology. What we fear mentally is almost always worse than what we experience physically. By deliberately practicing hardship, he inoculated himself against the fear of losing his wealth and status, which, given his dangerous proximity to Nero's unpredictable temper, was a very real possibility. He, who has prepared himself beforehand for the coming of adversity, has already taken away the power of all harm that can come to him, Seneca wrote. This is the paradox of preparation. By willingly facing what we fear, we diminish its power over us. This approach runs directly counter to our modern instinct to avoid thinking about negative possibilities. We often believe that imagining bad outcomes will somehow make them more likely to occur, or at least make us feel worse in the present. But the Stoics understood something that modern psychology has now confirmed. Avoidance actually increases anxiety, while strategic confrontation reduces it. Let me clarify something important here. There's a crucial difference between catastrophic thinking and strategic negative visualization. Catastrophic thinking is unstructured, repetitive worry that spirals out of control. It's ruminating on worst-case scenarios without purpose or resolution. This kind of thinking does indeed increase anxiety and serves no constructive purpose. Strategic negative visualization, on the other hand, is structured, purposeful, and solution-oriented. You're not just worrying about what might go wrong. You're mentally rehearsing specific challenges and your response to them. The goal isn't to make yourself anxious, but to prepare yourself emotionally and practically. Let's practice this together right now. Think of a situation coming up in your life that you're somewhat concerned about. Maybe it's a difficult conversation, a presentation, or a challenging project. Got it? Now let's apply the premeditatio malorum technique. First, ask yourself, what specifically might go wrong here? Be concrete and realistic, not catastrophic. Maybe your boss might reject your proposal, or your technology might fail during the presentation, or your team member might disagree with your approach. Second, imagine yourself experiencing this difficulty. How would it feel? What would be your immediate reaction? Third, and this is the critical part that transforms this from worry into preparation, ask yourself, how would I respond constructively if this happened? Visualize yourself handling the situation with calm, dignity, and wisdom. Finally, remind yourself, even if this happens, I can handle it. It would be challenging, but not catastrophic. What you've just done is fundamentally different from worry. You've mentally rehearsed a challenge and your response to it, creating what psychologists call implementation intentions, specific if-then plans for how you'll handle situations. I use this technique before every important meeting. For example, if I'm preparing for a presentation, I'll specifically visualize potential challenges. What if someone asks a question I can't answer? What if the technology fails? What if people seem disengaged? For each scenario, I mentally rehearse responding with composure rather than panic or defensiveness. The result is that when, not if, something goes off script, it feels familiar rather than shocking, and I can respond thoughtfully rather than reactively. A client of mine, a senior executive, used this approach before a high-stakes board meeting where she was proposing a controversial new direction for the company. Instead of just rehearsing her ideal presentation, she systematically visualized potential objections, difficult questions, and even outright rejection. She mentally practiced responding to each scenario with composure and clarity. When the actual meeting arrived, several board members did indeed raise strong objections, just as she had anticipated. But rather than feeling ambushed or defensive, she found herself thinking, here's the objection I prepared for, and she responded with confidence and poise. Later, she told me, it wasn't that nothing went wrong, plenty did, but nothing surprised me, and that made all the difference. This is the surprising benefit of the premeditatio malorum practice. Things rarely turn out as badly as we can imagine. By facing our fears directly in a controlled mental environment, we not only prepare for difficulties, but often discover they aren't as devastating as our anxious minds suggest. As Seneca observed after one of his voluntary poverty exercises, "Is this what I feared?" The science behind this practice is compelling. When we mentally rehearse a scenario, we activate many of the same neural pathways that fire during the actual experience. This creates a kind of mental muscle memory that makes our desired response more automatic when the real situation arises. Research from the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology found that people who practiced this type of emotional fire drill showed 32% greater resilience when facing actual stresses compared to those who didn't prepare mentally. Now, a common misunderstanding needs to be addressed. Premeditation of challenges is not the same as pessimism. Pessimism is a general expectation that bad things will happen and that little can be done about them. The Stoic practice, by contrast, is about specific preparation that actually increases your sense of agency and control. Remember our discussion about the dichotomy of control? The premeditatio malorum practice works hand in hand with that principle. You're preparing not just for what might go wrong, but specifically for how you'll respond, which is the aspect that remains within your control regardless of external circumstances. I recommend incorporating this practice into your morning routine. Spend just 2 minutes visualizing potential challenges you might face that day. Imagine yourself responding to these challenges with calm, clarity, and wisdom, rather than with reactivity. This brief mental rehearsal can dramatically change how you experience difficulties when they arise. For example, before your commute, you might briefly visualize getting stuck in traffic and mentally rehearse responding with patience rather than frustration. Before a meeting with a difficult colleague, visualize them making their typical challenging comments and practice responding thoughtfully rather than defensively. The key is specificity. Don't just think, "My day might be difficult." Instead, identify particular challenges that are likely to arise and visualize your specific response. This transforms vague anxiety into concrete preparation. A woman I worked with used this technique to transform her relationship with her teenage son. Every morning she would visualize potential conflicts that might arise about homework, screen time, or household responsibilities, and mentally rehearse responding with calm authority rather than emotional reactivity. Within weeks, their relationship had dramatically improved, not because her son's behavior had changed, at least not initially, but because her responses had become more measured and effective. When practicing this technique, be careful to avoid a common pitfall. Don't confuse premeditation with rumination. Rumination is repetitive, unproductive worry that doesn't lead to solutions. Premeditation is structured, time-limited mental rehearsal that focuses on constructive responses. The difference is crucial. To avoid rumination, set a specific time limit for your negative visualization practice. Just 2 or 3 minutes is sufficient. And always end by visualizing your constructive response, not just the problem itself. The goal is preparation, not worry. I had a client who was an entrepreneur preparing for a major pitch to investors. Using the premeditatio malorum technique, he visualized various challenging scenarios. Investors asking tough questions about his financials, competitors being mentioned, or the investors looking bored during his presentation. For each scenario, he practiced responding calmly and confidently. When the actual pitch came, several of these exact challenges occurred. An investor did question his revenue projections, and another mentioned a competitor's approach. But because he had mentally rehearsed these scenarios, he was able to respond thoughtfully rather than reactively. He got the investment. Afterward, he told me something fascinating. The strange thing is, once I had visualized all those challenges and prepared my responses, I actually felt more confident going in. Imagining the worst cases and knowing I could handle them actually made me less anxious, not more. This points to perhaps the most surprising benefit of the premeditatio malorum practice. It often leads to greater appreciation and gratitude for the present. When we deliberately contemplate what could go wrong or what we might lose, we naturally become more aware of and grateful for what's going right and what we currently have. Seneca put it this way: "He who has prepared for all possibilities has made the power of misfortune subject to himself." There's a profound freedom in knowing that you've faced your fears mentally and developed the confidence that you can handle whatever comes. This practice isn't about expecting disaster or living in a state of anxiety. Rather, it's about removing the power that potential difficulties have over your peace of mind. When you've already faced the worst in your imagination and developed a plan for handling it, you no longer need to fear it in reality. One final note: this practice becomes particularly powerful when combined with the other Stoic techniques we've discussed. Use the dichotomy of control to separate what aspects of challenging situations you can and cannot influence. Then use premeditatio malorum to prepare specifically for how you'll handle the aspects within your control. This two-step approach, sorting what you can control from what you can't, then preparing for how you'll handle what's in your control, creates an unshakable foundation for emotional resilience in the face of life's inevitable challenges. The Stoics weren't pessimists. They were realists who understood that by facing potential difficulties directly, we free ourselves from the anxiety of the unknown and develop the confidence that comes from preparation. As Marcus Aurelius wrote, "When you wake in the morning, tell yourself, the people I deal with today will be meddling, ungrateful, arrogant, dishonest, jealous, and surly." This wasn't pessimism. It was emotional preparation. This practice of visualizing challenges to prepare emotionally is powerful, but to truly master our emotional responses, we need a technique we can use in the exact moment when we're hit with a challenging situation. This is where what I call the interval technique comes in. A tool that Marcus Aurelius used to prevent intense emotions from hijacking his mind. It's so simple that you can apply it in 3 seconds, but so effective that it can prevent an emotional spiral that would otherwise last for hours. Have you ever said something in the heat of the moment that you regretted later? That email you sent while angry, the comment during an argument with your partner, or that reactive decision you made when feeling pressured? What if you could have had just 3 seconds to think before responding? Those 3 seconds might have changed everything. This is where we encounter one of the most practical and transformative Stoic insights. Between what happens to us and how we respond, there exists a space. Most people never notice this space. They experience stimulus and response as a single fused event. Something happens. They react. No gap, no choice, no freedom. But the Stoics discovered something revolutionary. This gap, however tiny, can be widened through practice. And in that widened space lies our freedom to choose our response rather than being driven by automatic reactions. The neuroscience behind this is fascinating. When you experience something your brain perceives as threatening, even just a critical comment or unexpected news, your amygdala, your brain's emotional alarm system, activates within milliseconds. This triggers a cascade of stress hormones that literally redirect blood flow away from your prefrontal cortex, the rational thinking part of your brain, and toward your limbs, preparing you for physical action. This was brilliant design for our ancestors facing predators, but it's remarkably unhelpful when facing modern challenges like criticism in a meeting or a rude email. In these situations, the last thing you need is less access to your rational thinking and more preparation for physical combat. Marcus Aurelius understood this struggle intimately. Despite ruling the vast Roman Empire, he wrote repeatedly in his private journal about his daily battle to create space between events and his reactions. When jarred, unavoidably by circumstances, revert at once to yourself and don't lose the rhythm more than you can help, he reminded himself. You'll have a better grasp of the harmony if you keep going back to it. This was his way of describing what I call the interval technique, the practice of creating a deliberate pause between stimulus and response. And while it sounds simple, this tiny space changes everything. The power of the interval lies in what it prevents. Without a pause, your automatic reactions, shaped by past experiences, fears, and biases, determine your behavior. With even a 3-second pause, you create space for choice, for wisdom, for alignment with your deeper values rather than your immediate impulses. Let's practice this right now. I want you to imagine a situation that typically triggers a strong emotional reaction in you. Maybe it's someone cutting you off in traffic, a certain tone your partner uses, or a specific type of email from your boss. Visualize that trigger in detail. See it, hear it, feel your body's initial reaction to it. Now, imagine inserting a deliberate 3-second pause before you respond. During those 3 seconds, take one deep, conscious breath, in through your nose for a count of 2, out through your mouth for a count of 3. Feel how this tiny intervention already begins to shift your emotional state. This simple practice, a 3-second pause paired with one conscious breath, is your first step toward emotional mastery. It doesn't eliminate the emotion, but it prevents the emotion from eliminating your choice. A breath serves as an ideal anchor during this pause because breathing is always available to you and has immediate physiological effects. When you take a slow, deliberate breath, you activate your parasympathetic nervous system, the rest and digest response that counteracts the stress response. Even one conscious breath can begin to restore blood flow to your prefrontal cortex, giving you greater access to your rational thinking precisely when you need it most. During this pause, after your breath, ask yourself one transformative question. Is this within my control? This question, drawing on the dichotomy of control we explored earlier, serves as a powerful pattern, interrupt. It immediately shifts your focus from reactive emotion to thoughtful discernment. I remember applying this technique during a particularly tense meeting. A colleague publicly criticized work my team had done, using language that felt dismissive and unfair. I felt that immediate surge of defensive energy, the tightening in my chest, the heat rising to my face, the words of justification forming instantly in my mind. But instead of responding immediately, I took those 3 seconds. I took one conscious breath. I asked myself, what aspects of this are within my control? In that tiny space, I realized I couldn't control my colleague's assessment or choice of words, but I could control how I responded. Rather than reacting defensively, I responded with curiosity, asking questions to better understand the concerns behind the criticism. That 3-second pause completely changed the trajectory of the conversation and saved me from potentially hours of post-meeting rumination and relationship repair. This technique is particularly powerful in conflicts with those closest to us. When tension arises with a partner, family member, or close friend, emotions escalate quickly precisely because we care so deeply. One reactive comment leads to another, and suddenly a minor disagreement becomes a major argument with hurt feelings on both sides. The interval technique breaks this escalation cycle. When you pause before responding to a triggering comment, you create space to choose a response that de-escalates rather than inflames the situation. Instead of matching intensity with intensity, you can respond with understanding even when feeling misunderstood. In professional settings, the pause transforms how you handle criticism or unexpected challenges. Instead of experiencing feedback as a threat that requires immediate defense, the pause allows you to receive information without immediately judging it or yourself. This makes you more adaptable, more coachable, and ultimately more effective. Of course, remembering to pause in heated moments is itself challenging. Our automatic reactions are deeply ingrained, and in moments of strong emotion, our best intentions often evaporate. This is why we need practical techniques to interrupt our patterns. Try creating physical triggers that remind you to pause. Some of my clients wear a specific ring or bracelet that serves as a tactile reminder. Others place small visual cues in environments where they typically experience triggers. A small dot on their computer monitor, phone, or dashboard. You can also use situational triggers, specific contexts where you know you tend to react automatically. For instance, if email triggers you, develop a rule that you'll always take one breath before opening any message. If traffic frustrates you, use red lights as reminders to practice the pause. The key is to start practicing the interval in low-stress situations. For the next 7 days, identify at least 5 minor daily triggers, small irritations, minor interruptions, slight frustrations, and deliberately practice your 3-second pause. This builds the neural pathway that makes the pause more accessible when you face higher stakes situations. As you become more skilled, gradually apply the technique to more challenging situations. Remember that you're developing a new mental habit, and like any habit, it becomes stronger and more automatic with consistent practice. Learning to recognize your body's early warning signals can help you implement the pause before a full emotional reaction takes hold. Most of us have physical tells that precede our emotional reactions. Tension in the shoulders, a change in breathing, a sensation in the stomach or chest. By becoming aware of these early physical signals, you can insert the pause earlier in the reaction process, when it's easier to redirect. A mother I worked with transformed her relationship with her teenage son using this technique. Their interactions had become a series of escalating conflicts, with both feeling unheard and misunderstood. I taught her the interval technique, and she committed to practicing it specifically in conversations with her son. When he would say something that previously would have triggered an immediate reaction, she would pause, take a breath, and ask herself what response would serve their relationship rather than her immediate emotional need to be right or in control. Within 2 weeks, she reported a dramatic shift. Not because her son had changed, teenagers rarely change overnight, but because her responses had. Her pause created space for understanding rather than reaction, and gradually this new pattern changed their entire dynamic. He began to open up more because he experienced being heard rather than judged. The beauty of the interval technique is that with consistent practice over 21 days, it begins to become automatic. What starts as a deliberate, sometimes awkward pause, gradually becomes an integrated part of how you respond to the world. You're literally rewiring your brain to create a new default, response, rather than reaction. Think of it as building a new mental muscle. At first, creating the pause requires conscious effort and doesn't feel natural. But with consistent practice, it becomes stronger and more automatic, until choosing your response rather than being driven by reaction becomes your new normal. The interval technique integrates perfectly with the other Stoic practices we've explored. During your pause, you can apply the dichotomy of control, questioning which aspects of the situation you can and cannot influence. You can draw on your premeditatio malorum practice, recognizing that you've already prepared for this type of challenge. All these practices work together, reinforcing each other to build your emotional resilience. Start small. Today, commit to practicing the 3-second pause at least 5 times. Set reminders on your phone if needed. Each time you practice, you're strengthening the neural pathway that makes this skill more accessible in the future. Remember that developing this skill isn't about perfection. There will still be times when you react automatically rather than respond thoughtfully. When this happens, don't judge yourself harshly. Simply notice what happened, learn from it, and recommit to your practice. Even the Stoic philosophers themselves needed constant reminders and regular practice. Marcus Aurelius wrote his reminders to himself throughout his life, not just once. The interval technique gives you the space to choose your response, but to truly transform your emotional experience, you need to understand what's happening at the most fundamental level, your interpretations. As Epictetus taught, it's not things that disturb us, but our interpretations about them. In the next chapter, I'll show you a tool that questions these automatic interpretations, a technique I use every day that literally transforms negative situations into opportunities for growth. Imagine that you're waiting for an important email response for days. Finally, it arrives, but it's a rejection. What determines your emotional reaction? The no itself, or what you tell yourself about that no? Is it just a disappointing message, or is it proof that you're not good enough? Is it a single rejection, or evidence that you'll never succeed? Same external event, completely different emotional experiences, all determined by your interpretation. This insight, that our interpretations create our emotional reality, is perhaps the most profound discovery of Stoic philosophy. Epictetus expressed it with stunning clarity when he wrote, "Men are disturbed not by things, but by the views which they take of them." This fundamental principle forms the cornerstone of emotional mastery. Think about it this way. Between any event and your emotional response lies an often invisible step, your interpretation. Something happens, you instantly interpret what it means, and then you feel an emotion based on that interpretation. Most people experience this as a single, fused process, event to emotion. But the Stoics recognized the crucial middle step, event, interpretation, emotion. Let's try a simple experiment. Imagine someone walks past you without acknowledging your greeting. Now, consider 3 different interpretations of this same event. 1. They're rude and disrespectful. 2. They didn't see or hear me. 3. They must be having a really difficult day. Notice how each interpretation would create a completely different emotional response. Anger in the first case, neutral understanding in the second, compassion in the third. Same external event, 3 entirely different emotional experiences. This explains why different people can have radically different reactions to identical situations. It's not the situation itself that determines the emotional response. It's the meaning we assign to it. Why does your brain default to negative interpretations so readily? Evolution has programmed us to scan for threats and make quick judgments. It was better for our ancestors to mistakenly see a snake that wasn't there than to miss a snake that was. This negativity bias was useful for survival, but creates unnecessary suffering in modern life, where most threats are social rather than physical. Fortunately, the Stoics developed techniques to question our automatic interpretations, and these techniques align remarkably well with modern cognitive approaches. Here's a simple yet powerful 4-question process derived from Socratic questioning that you can use whenever you notice yourself having a strong emotional reaction. First, is my interpretation definitely true? Not possibly true or partially true, but definitely true. Can you be absolutely certain? Second, can I absolutely know that it's true? What evidence might you be missing? What other explanations could account for the same facts? Third, how do I feel when I believe this thought? What impact does this interpretation have on your emotions, your body, your actions? Fourth, who would I be without this thought? How would you experience this situation if you didn't attach this particular meaning to it? Let's practice this right now. Think of a recent situation that triggered a negative emotional response. Perhaps criticism at work, a disagreement with someone close to you, or a rejection of some kind. Got it? Now apply the 4 questions to your interpretation of what happened. For example, if your boss gave critical feedback and your interpretation was, "My boss thinks I'm incompetent," ask yourself, is this definitely true? Can I absolutely know that's what they think? How do I feel when I believe this thought? Who would I be without this interpretation? Most people discover that their most painful interpretations cannot pass the test of absolute certainty. And once you recognize that your interpretation is just one possibility among many, it loses its grip on your emotions. Another powerful technique is what I call the alternative perspective practice. When something triggers you emotionally, pause and ask, what are at least 3 other ways to interpret this situation? This simple practice creates psychological flexibility, the ability to view situations from multiple perspectives rather than being locked into a single, often negative interpretation. Research in cognitive psychology shows that people who can generate multiple interpretations of challenging events show significantly greater emotional resilience. Let's see how this works with rejection. Imagine you applied for a position and received a rejection letter. Your automatic interpretation might be, "I'm not good enough." Using the alternative perspective practice, you might consider 1. This particular opportunity wasn't the right fit for my specific skills. 2. They likely had many qualified candidates and had to make a difficult choice. 3. This frees me to find an opportunity that better matches my strengths. Notice how each alternative interpretation creates space for a different emotional response, not denial of disappointment, but freedom from unnecessary additional suffering caused by overly negative interpretations. This approach is particularly powerful in conflicts. When someone says something that feels like an attack, our default interpretation is often, "They're trying to hurt me," or "They don't respect me." But alternative interpretations might include, "They're expressing a need they haven't articulated clearly," or "They're speaking from their own pain or fear." These alternative perspectives don't just feel better, they're often more accurate and lead to more constructive responses. One of the most practical Stoic techniques for questioning interpretations is what I call the evidence test. The practice of rigorously separating observable facts from your interpretations of those facts. For example, the fact might be, "My colleague didn't acknowledge my contribution in the meeting." The interpretation might be, "My colleague is trying to take credit for my work." The evidence test asks, what facts do I actually have? What am I adding to those facts? Often, we discover that our most painful interpretations go far beyond the available evidence. And when we stick to the facts, our emotional response becomes more proportionate to what actually happened rather than to our catastrophic interpretation. A subtle but powerful shift in language can also transform how you relate to your interpretations. I call this the provisional interpretation practice. Instead of thinking, "This is definitely X," shift to, "I'm currently interpreting this as X, but there are other possibilities." This small linguistic change, from definitive to provisional, creates psychological space. It reminds you that your interpretation is a hypothesis, not a fact. And this recognition alone can dramatically reduce emotional reactivity. The Stoics were remarkably insightful about what modern psychology calls cognitive distortions. patterns of thought that create unnecessary suffering. For instance, Marcus Aurelius cautioned against adding to our impressions. Do not add to your impression, "He insulted me," but rather stay with, "This is what he said." Do not add, "This is harmful to me," but rather, "He believes this is good for him." Marcus was identifying what we now call mind reading, assuming we know what others think, and catastrophizing, interpreting events as worse than they are. Cognitive distortions that amplify emotional suffering. A simple daily practice that takes just 2 minutes can help you become more aware of your interpretations. I call it the interpretation log. Each evening, identify 1 or 2 emotional reactions you experienced that day and write down 1. What happened, the facts. 2. Your interpretation, the meaning you assigned. 3. The emotion that followed. 4. An alternative interpretation that might be equally valid. This brief practice develops your ability to distinguish facts from interpretations and creates the habit of questioning your automatic meanings. One client who did this for 21 days straight told me, "I can't believe how many things I was absolutely certain about that turned out to be just one possible interpretation among many." There's a subtle trap that keeps many people stuck in negative interpretations: the desire to be right. Sometimes we cling to our painful interpretations because they feel true, or because they protect us from perceived vulnerability. Recognizing when you're attached to an interpretation because it feels safer or more familiar can be a powerful step toward emotional freedom. Remember, the goal isn't to force yourself to adopt positive interpretations regardless of evidence. Toxic positivity is just as disconnected from reality as catastrophic negativity. The Stoic approach is about seeing clearly, recognizing when your interpretations go beyond the facts, and cultivating the flexibility to consider multiple perspectives. Instead, the Stoics advocated for what I call useful interpretations, ways of viewing situations that align with reality while supporting your well-being and effectiveness. When multiple interpretations could reasonably fit the facts, why not choose the one that creates less suffering and more constructive action? For example, if someone cuts you off in traffic, interpretations like "they're deliberately disrespecting me" or "people are terrible drivers" create anger without benefit. An interpretation like "that person might be having an emergency" or "most people are doing their best even when they make mistakes" creates a more peaceful experience without denying the facts. This isn't pretending the challenging event didn't happen. It's choosing how to frame what happened in a way that serves your well-being while remaining grounded in reality. I know questioning your interpretations can feel strange at first. We're so accustomed to experiencing our thoughts as direct perceptions of reality that stepping back from them requires practice. Be patient with yourself as you develop this skill. Even the Stoics themselves needed constant practice. That's why Marcus Aurelius wrote daily reminders to himself throughout his life. Start small. Choose one trigger today, perhaps a minor irritation or disappointment, and deliberately practice identifying your interpretation and generating alternatives. Notice how different interpretations would create different emotional experiences. With consistent practice, this perspective-taking becomes more natural and automatic. The beauty of working with interpretations is that it gives you access to the source code of your emotional experience. Rather than trying to manage emotions after they've fully formed, you're addressing them at their point of creation, in the meanings you assign to events. This is the heart of what the Stoics meant by leading your mind rather than following it. You're no longer at the mercy of automatic interpretations, but actively engaged in choosing how you make sense of your experiences. Questioning your interpretations is a transformative skill, but the Stoics knew we need something more: a daily practice of reflection. Marcus Aurelius didn't write in his journal occasionally. He had a disciplined practice he used every morning and evening. And the most fascinating thing? The exact structure of this journal has been preserved and produces remarkable results when applied today. In the next chapter, I'll show you the precise protocol that transformed an anxious emperor into a model of serenity. Have you ever tried to meditate and found it difficult? That feeling of trying to quiet your mind only to find it getting louder. What if there was a form of meditation using pen and paper that produces even deeper results? This is exactly what Marcus Aurelius practiced every morning and evening, not sitting cross-legged in silence, but actively processing his thoughts through writing. The private journal of Marcus Aurelius, what we now call Meditations, was never intended for publication. These were his personal notes, written by candlelight after long days governing the Roman Empire, dealing with plague, war, and political intrigue. His journal was essentially a conversation with himself, a way to process challenges, clarify his thinking, and recommit to his principles. And here's what's fascinating. Modern neuroscience confirms that writing is significantly more powerful than just thinking. When you externalize your thoughts onto paper, you engage different neural pathways. Studies from UCLA show that labeling emotions in written form reduces amygdala activity, the brain's alarm system, by up to 40%. Writing literally helps you process emotions more effectively than just thinking about them. Let me share with you the morning protocol that Marcus Aurelius used to start his day with stoic clarity. Each morning, before the demands of the day took over, he would write responses to 3 key questions. First, what challenges might I face today, and how will I apply my principles to them? Second, what am I grateful for in this moment? Third, what one virtue do I want to embody today? Let's try the first part of this protocol right now. Take 30 seconds to think about your day ahead. What's one potential challenge you might face? Maybe a difficult conversation, a deadline, or even just the challenge of maintaining patience with yourself or others. Now, how might you apply what we've learned about the dichotomy of control or the interpretation of events to that challenge? Take a moment to actually think about this. Did you notice how that brief reflection already creates a sense of preparedness? Instead of walking blindly into your challenges, you're approaching them with intention and philosophy. The evening protocol that complemented Marcus's morning practice consisted of 4 reflective questions. First, what went well today and why? Second, what did I find challenging and how did I respond? Third, is there anything I could have done better? Fourth, what wisdom can I take forward? This structured reflection isn't about self-judgment, but about learning and growth. By reviewing your day through the lens of Stoic principles, you extract lessons that might otherwise be lost. What makes this journaling practice so powerful is that it helps you identify patterns in your emotional reactions over time. When you record your responses to similar triggers day after day, you begin to see the recurring interpretations and judgments that drive your emotions. As Seneca wrote, "What progress have I made? I am beginning to be my own friend." This self-awareness is the foundation of emotional mastery. Seneca himself practiced another form of reflective writing, the letter. He would write letters to his friend Lucilius, exploring philosophical questions and challenges. These weren't just communications, they were a way for Seneca to clarify his own thinking. As he explained, "I write not for the eyes of many, but only for yours. For each of us is audience enough for the other." You can adapt this technique by writing letters you never send. When facing a difficult decision, write a letter explaining your thinking to an imaginary wise friend. The act of articulating your reasoning often reveals clarity that wasn't apparent when the thoughts remained jumbled in your mind. This approach is particularly effective for difficult decisions. When you're torn between options, try this Stoic journaling exercise. create two columns on a page. In one column, list the observable facts of the situation. In the other, list your impressions, opinions, and interpretations. This simple division, facts versus impressions, often creates immediate clarity about the right course of action. For example, if you're considering a job change, the facts might include salary figures, commute times, and specific responsibilities. Your impressions might include fears about failure, hopes about status, or assumptions about future enjoyment. Separating these elements helps you see which aspects of your decision-making are grounded in reality and which are based on interpretations that could be questioned. The Stoic journaling practice is also remarkably effective for processing conflicts. When someone has upset you, try writing from multiple perspectives. First, from your viewpoint, then from theirs, and finally from the perspective of a neutral, wise observer. This expanded awareness often dissolves resentment and reveals constructive paths forward. One of my favorite journaling techniques for intense emotional moments comes from Epictetus, who taught his students to distinguish between their initial impression of an event and their response to it. When you're experiencing a strong emotion like anger or anxiety, try this protocol. First, write, "I am feeling emotion because I'm telling myself that interpretation." Second, question, "Is this interpretation definitely true? What are other possibilities?" Third, respond, "A wiser response would be..." This simple structure helps you create space between the event, your interpretation, and your response, the fundamental Stoic practice we've been exploring throughout. It's important to distinguish between productive reflection and unproductive rumination when journaling. Rumination involves repeatedly going over the same thoughts without reaching new insights or solutions. It's like driving in circles. Reflection, by contrast, is structured thinking that leads to clarity and wisdom. Your Stoic journaling should always have a purpose: to learn, to process, to prepare, or to clarify, never to simply dwell on problems. In our digital age, you might wonder whether physical writing or digital tools are better for Stoic journaling. Research from the University of Tokyo suggests that handwriting activates more regions of the brain associated with learning and memory than typing does. However, the most important factor is consistency. Whichever method you'll actually practice regularly is the right one for you. There are excellent apps specifically designed for philosophical journaling if that suits your lifestyle better. The key challenge is creating the habit. 5 minutes of Stoic journaling each day is far more valuable than an hour once a week. To integrate this practice into your routine, try attaching it to existing habits, what psychologists call habit stacking. Write your morning reflection while having your first cup of coffee. Complete your evening reflection right after brushing your teeth. These consistent contextual cues help establish the practice. Start with a 30-day commitment to Stoic journaling. For the first 10 days, simply write for 3 minutes each morning, reflecting on the day ahead and how you'll apply Stoic principles. For the next 10 days, add an evening reflection, reviewing how you responded to challenges. For the final 10 days, expand to the full protocol we've discussed. This gradual progression helps you develop from a beginner to an advanced practitioner of Stoic journaling. And don't worry about doing it perfectly. Marcus Aurelius himself wasn't writing polished philosophical treatises, but rough, sometimes repetitive notes to himself. The value lies in the process, not the product. A client once told me that after 21 days of consistent Stoic journaling, she noticed something remarkable. She was having the same thoughts she'd always had, but her relationship to those thoughts had fundamentally changed. "Before, I was my thoughts," she explained. "Now I have thoughts. I can observe them, question them, and choose which ones to follow." This is precisely what Marcus Aurelius was practicing. He wasn't trying to stop having worried, angry, or fearful thoughts. He was developing the ability to recognize these as just thoughts, rather than objective reality. As he wrote to himself, "The things you think about determine the quality of your mind. Your soul takes on the color of your thoughts." The beauty of the Stoic journaling practice is that it creates a feedback loop of growth. Each day's reflection informs the next day's actions, which create new material for reflection, leading to better actions, and so on. This virtuous cycle accelerates your development of emotional mastery. I encourage you to start small. Tonight, take just 5 minutes before bed to write about one challenge you faced today. What interpretation drove your emotional response, and how you might view it differently through a Stoic lens. Tomorrow morning, take 3 minutes to anticipate a challenge and how you'll apply one Stoic principle to it. This simple practice, done consistently, will gradually transform how you process experiences. The changes may seem subtle at first, a bit less reactivity here, a moment of clarity there, but over time, they compound into a fundamentally different relationship with your thoughts and emotions. Remember that the Stoics themselves needed these practices throughout their lives. These weren't techniques they mastered once and then abandoned. They were daily disciplines that supported their ongoing development. Even Seneca, one of the most articulate Stoic philosophers, wrote that he was still learning how to be a friend to myself. This protocol of journaling gives you a powerful daily practice, but the Stoics knew that we also need tools for life's most challenging moments. That's why Seneca, despite being one of the wealthiest and most powerful men in Rome, regularly practiced what we call voluntary poverty. He discovered that directly confronting his greatest fears, not just in thought but in practice, created extraordinary emotional immunity. In the next chapter, I'll show you how to adapt this radical practice for our modern lives. Have you ever noticed how a small inconvenience, like losing internet connection for an hour, can completely ruin your mood? That moment when your carefully crafted comfort zone gets disrupted and suddenly you're irritable, frustrated, and your entire day feels derailed. It's remarkable how dependent we've become on constant comfort, isn't it? And what if I told you this dependency is actually making us more emotionally fragile, not less? This is where the Stoics offer us something radically different from modern self-help advice. While today's wellness culture often emphasizes removing discomfort from our lives, the Stoics believed in deliberately seeking small, controlled doses of discomfort as a path to emotional resilience. Seneca, despite being one of the wealthiest men in Rome, regularly practiced what he called voluntary poverty. Several days each month, he would dress in simple clothes, eat the plainest food, and sleep on a hard mat. As he explained in a letter to his friend Lucilius, set aside a certain number of days during which you shall be content with the scantiest and cheapest fare, with coarse and rough dress, saying to yourself the while, "Is this the condition that I feared?" Why would someone voluntarily choose discomfort? Because Seneca had discovered what psychologists now call the paradox of comfort. The more we structure our lives to avoid all discomfort, the more psychologically fragile we become. By contrast, deliberately engaging with small, controlled discomforts builds our tolerance for life's inevitable challenges. This principle aligns with what modern science calls hormesis, the biological phenomenon where small doses of stress strengthen living systems. Just as your muscles grow stronger through the controlled stress of exercise, your emotional resilience grows through controlled exposure to discomfort. Exercise itself is a perfect example of voluntary discomfort. It's challenging while you're doing it, but makes you stronger and more resilient afterward. Let me offer you 3 simple voluntary discomfort practices you can begin today. First, try a cold shower finish. End your normal shower with 30 seconds of cold water. Notice your initial resistance, how your body responds, and how quickly you adapt. This brief practice not only has physical benefits, but trains your mind to embrace temporary discomfort without resistance. Second, practice digital minimalism for 1 hour each day. Turn off all notifications, put your phone in another room, and experience the initial discomfort of being disconnected. Notice the urges to check your device and how they pass, if not indulged. Third, try comfort food fasting. For one day, eat only simple, nutritious foods without added sugars or flavor enhancers. Notice how your relationship with food changes when it's viewed as nourishment rather than entertainment. These practices might seem trivial compared to the hardships the Stoics endured, but they serve the same psychological purpose. They train your mind to distinguish between genuine hardship and mere inconvenience, between what's truly unbearable and what's merely uncomfortable. Speaking of food, intermittent fasting was actually a core Stoic practice long before it became a modern health trend. Musonius Rufus, a contemporary of Seneca, advocated regular fasting not just for physical health, but for mental clarity and self-discipline. The Stoics understood that our relationship with food often reflects our relationship with pleasure and comfort more broadly. When you voluntarily abstain from eating for 16 or 18 hours, you discover something remarkable. Hunger isn't an emergency. It's just a sensation that rises, peaks, and passes. This discovery transfers to other discomforts as well. The next time you feel anxious before speaking publicly, you can remind yourself, this discomfort is like hunger. It will pass, and I can function perfectly well in its presence. Beyond physical discomforts, the Stoics also recognized the value of social discomfort. Deliberately putting yourself in situations where you might face judgment or rejection builds what we now call social resilience. The ability to maintain your equilibrium regardless of others' responses. Try this small social comfort challenge. Ask for something minor that might be refused. Perhaps a discount at a store, an upgrade at a hotel, or a special request at a restaurant. The goal isn't to get what you ask for. It's to practice maintaining your composure, whether the answer is yes or no. Each small experience of rejection desensitizes you to the fear of social disapproval that keeps so many people from pursuing their goals. These practices of voluntary discomfort aren't about self-punishment or asceticism for its own sake. They're strategic exercises that build your capacity to function well under conditions that would derail most people. As Marcus Aurelius reminded himself, the impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way. To structure these practices effectively, I recommend what I call the 7-Day Discomfort Challenge. Each day, choose one specific form of discomfort to engage with deliberately. Day 1, physical discomfort, cold shower, hard floor sitting, etc. Day 2, hunger discomfort, extended fasting period. Day 3, pleasure delay, postpone something enjoyable. Day 4, simplicity practice, plain food, simple clothes. Day 5, social discomfort, request something, speak up. Day 6, convenience sacrifice, take stairs, walk instead of drive. Day 7, technology restriction, reduced screen time. The key is progression. Each day, try to extend your comfort zone slightly more than the previous day. Maybe your cold shower lasts 15 seconds longer, or your fast extends by an additional hour. This progressive training is how you build resilience systematically rather than sporadically. These practices are particularly effective for addressing anxiety. Anxiety thrives on avoidance. The more you avoid what makes you anxious, the stronger your anxiety grows. Voluntary discomfort reverses this pattern. By deliberately facing controlled discomfort, you build evidence for your ability to handle challenges. Your inner dialogue shifts from, "I can't handle this," to, "I've voluntarily endured similar discomforts before." I once worked with someone who had debilitating social anxiety that prevented them from attending important professional events. We started with tiny voluntary social discomforts, making eye contact with a cashier, asking a stranger for directions, and gradually progressed to more challenging situations. Within 3 months, they were not only attending networking events, but actually enjoying the conversations. The voluntary discomfort practice had transformed their relationship with social anxiety. This example highlights an important distinction. There's a profound difference between unnecessary suffering and strategic discomfort. Unnecessary suffering comes from resistance to what is already happening, fighting reality rather than accepting it. Strategic discomfort, by contrast, is deliberately chosen for its developmental benefits. One keeps you stuck, the other helps you grow. Epictetus, who knew suffering intimately as a former slave, distinguished between these experiences. Make the best use of what is in your power, and take the rest as it happens. Voluntary discomfort puts you in the driver's seat, choosing the conditions under which you practice resilience, rather than having them forced upon you. One executive I worked with transformed his anxiety response through daily voluntary discomfort practices. Each morning, he would start his day with a cold shower, followed by 20 minutes of sitting in silence with his anxious thoughts rather than distracting himself. He would deliberately choose the longest checkout line at stores to practice patience. Within weeks, colleagues were commenting on his newfound calm during crisis situations at work. When asked about his transformation, he explained, "I've realized that most of my anxiety came from trying to avoid discomfort. Once I started practicing discomfort deliberately, it lost its power over me." What makes this approach so effective is that it targets the meta-problem behind most emotional suffering, not the discomfort itself, but our resistance to discomfort. As the Stoics recognized, pain is inevitable, but suffering is largely created by our desperate attempts to avoid pain. When you voluntarily embrace discomfort in small, strategic doses, you're essentially inoculating yourself against this resistance. The beauty of voluntary discomfort is that you can seamlessly incorporate it into your daily routine. Take the stairs instead of the elevator. Choose the grocery bag that's slightly heavier. Sit with a straight back rather than slouching. Wait an extra moment before scratching an itch. Each tiny practice builds your discomfort muscle without requiring additional time in your schedule. Start with just one practice today. Perhaps the simplest is temperature discomfort, slightly too warm or too cold without immediately adjusting. Notice your instinct to fix the discomfort immediately, and practice sitting with it for just 30 seconds longer than feels natural. Pay attention not just to the sensation itself, but to your relationship with the sensation. Can you observe it with curiosity rather than resistance? As you build this practice over time, you'll notice something remarkable happening. The gap between stimulus and response that we discussed earlier naturally widens. You'll find yourself less reactive, not just to discomfort, but to all triggering situations. This is because voluntary discomfort trains the fundamental skill underlying all emotional mastery, the ability to experience a sensation without being controlled by it. The Stoics weren't masochists seeking pain for its own sake. They were pragmatic psychologists who recognized that comfort dependency creates fragility, while strategic discomfort builds robustness. As Seneca put it, "We should have our affairs under control, but our principle ready for adversity." In our comfort-obsessed modern world, this ancient practice is more relevant than ever. We've created environments so comfortable that our psychological muscles have atrophied. Voluntary discomfort is the deliberate exercise program to rebuild our emotional resilience. Remember that you're not practicing discomfort to endure a miserable life. Quite the opposite. You're building the capacity to remain calm and centered regardless of external conditions. This is true freedom, not the absence of challenge, but the ability to function well in the presence of challenge. Start small, be consistent, and watch as your relationship with discomfort transforms. The practices themselves may never become enjoyable in the conventional sense. Cold showers rarely feel pleasant in the moment, but your relationship with them will change fundamentally. What once seemed unbearable becomes manageable. What seemed manageable becomes trivial. Voluntary discomfort strengthens your ability to face challenges. But to truly live as the Stoics taught, we need to understand a deeper dimension: how to find tranquility even amid chaos. Epictetus, who lived as a slave, discovered a mental technique we call the view from above, a practice that instantly transforms how you see your current problems. It's a tool so powerful for gaining perspective that astronauts report experiencing it naturally when seeing Earth from space. Imagine that you could see your current problems from 10,000 feet in the air. How would they appear? How important would they really be? This shift in perspective is exactly what the Stoics practiced to free themselves from the mental prison of narrow thinking. And it's a technique that can transform your emotional response to any challenge in minutes. Marcus Aurelius, perhaps more than any other Stoic, regularly reminded himself of his cosmic insignificance. Despite being the most powerful man in the world, he wrote, "Think of the universal substance, of which you have a very small portion, and of universal time, of which a short and indivisible interval has been assigned to you, and of destiny and the thread of your fate. What a small part of it you are." This wasn't self-deprecation or nihilism. It was a deliberate mental exercise to gain perspective. By zooming out and seeing himself as a tiny part of a vast cosmos, Marcus could instantly reduce the emotional impact of whatever problem was before him. A betrayal by a close advisor or a military setback might seem catastrophic from close-up, but from the perspective of cosmic time and space, it was a fleeting moment of little consequence. This practice of gaining perspective through mental zooming out is what I call the view from above technique, and remarkably, it has a modern parallel in what astronauts experience when seeing Earth from space. Astronauts consistently report a profound psychological transformation called the overview effect, a cognitive shift in awareness that occurs when viewing Earth from orbit. From that vantage point, national boundaries disappear, conflicts seem petty, and the fragility and unity of our planet become viscerally apparent. One astronaut described it as an instant global consciousness, a people orientation, an intense dissatisfaction with the state of the world, and a compulsion to do something about it. Another said, "From out there on the moon, international politics look so petty." You don't need to travel to space to experience this perspective shift. The Stoics developed techniques to achieve it mentally, and you can practice them right now, wherever you are. Let's try a simplified version of the Stoic view from above exercise together. Close your eyes for a moment if you're in a safe place to do so. Imagine yourself rising up from where you're sitting, floating upward. See your surroundings getting smaller, your home or office, your neighborhood, your city. Continue rising until you can see your entire country, then the continent, then the whole Earth as a blue marble in space. From this vantage point, think about the problem that's been most on your mind lately. How does it look from up here? What importance does it hold against the backdrop of the entire planet, with its billions of people, each with their own concerns and challenges? This mental exercise isn't about dismissing your problems as unimportant. Rather, it's about right-sizing them, seeing them in proper proportion. When we're mentally zoomed in on a problem, it occupies our entire field of vision. When we zoom out, we gain context and perspective. Another powerful version of this technique involves temporal rather than spatial expansion. I call this the timeline perspective. When facing a challenging situation, ask yourself, will this matter in a week, a month, a year, 10 years, 100 years? This question instantly creates emotional distance from problems that feel all-consuming in the moment. That argument with your partner, that mistake at work, that embarrassing moment, How significant will they be when viewed across the span of your entire life, let alone across centuries? Let's practice this right now with your current biggest problem. Take a moment to identify the issue that's causing you the most stress or emotional turmoil. Now, mentally project yourself 1 year into the future and look back at this problem. How significant does it seem from that vantage point? Now project yourself 5 years forward, then 10 years, then to the end of your life. With each step back in time, notice how the emotional weight of the problem typically diminishes. I remember applying this technique during a particularly stressful project deadline. Everything seemed to be going wrong. Technical issues, team conflicts, and unrealistic expectations from stakeholders. In the midst of this chaos, I took 5 minutes to practice the view from above. I visualized the project from increasingly distant perspectives, how it would look in a month when it was complete, how it would appear in my career retrospective years later, how significant it would be in the grand scheme of human endeavors. The problem didn't disappear, but my relationship to it transformed. I gained a calmness and clarity that helped me lead my team through the crisis more effectively. I stopped reacting to each new issue as a catastrophe and started seeing the patterns that needed addressing. This perspective-expanding technique is particularly effective for diffusing interpersonal conflicts. When someone has upset or offended you, the Stoic approach is to zoom out and see both yourself and the other person as tiny specks in a vast cosmos, both struggling, both flawed, both temporary. Marcus Aurelius used this approach constantly, reminding himself, "Soon you will have forgotten all things, and soon all things will have forgotten you." Again, this wasn't pessimism, but perspective. A way of seeing that the grudges we hold and the offenses we nurse are ultimately insignificant when viewed from sufficient distance. Try this the next time you find yourself in conflict with someone. Mentally zoom out until you can see both yourself and the other person from a great height or distance in time. From this perspective, can you still maintain the same level of anger or resentment? Or does the conflict begin to seem like what it often is, a misunderstanding between two imperfect humans doing their best with limited information? The view from above also serves as a powerful antidote to what psychologists call the tunnel vision effect of anxiety. When we're anxious, our attention narrows to focus exclusively on perceived threats, excluding broader context that might reassure us. By deliberately expanding our perspective, we counteract this tunnel vision and regain access to more balanced thinking. For example, if you're anxious about a presentation, your focus might narrow to all the things that could go wrong, creating a distorted picture of reality. The view from above technique helps you see the presentation in a broader context, as one of hundreds you'll give in your career, as a small part of your professional development, as an opportunity to learn regardless of outcome. One of the most profound applications of this technique comes from the Stoic reflection on mortality, what the Romans called memento mori, remember that you will die. While this might sound morbid to modern ears, the Stoics found that regular contemplation of mortality was a powerful tool for clarifying what truly matters. When you remember that your time is finite, petty concerns and trivial grievances tend to fall away. As Seneca wrote, "Let us prepare our minds as if we'd come to the very end of life. Let us postpone nothing. Let us balance life's books each day. The one who puts the finishing touches on their life each day is never short of time." Try this perspective exercise. Imagine you have learned you have only 1 year left to live. From this vantage point, how important are the things currently filling your to-do list and occupying your mental space? What falls away as trivial? What suddenly stands out as essential? This isn't about inducing panic or despair, but about using the clarifying power of limited time to cut through the noise and focus on what truly matters to you. After doing this exercise, many people report a feeling of lightness as they realize how much mental energy they've been devoting to concerns that, from this perspective, seem insignificant. After practicing the view from above, a useful follow-up exercise is what I call the priority realignment. Take your current list of concerns or priorities and reorganize them based on how they appear from this expanded perspective. You might be surprised to discover that what seemed urgent this morning now falls to the bottom of your list, while something you've been postponing suddenly appears essential. The Stoics would practice these perspective exercises daily, not just in times of crisis. Marcus Aurelius began many of his journal entries with cosmic reflections, reminding himself of his place in the universe before addressing the day's challenges. This regular practice built his capacity to maintain perspective even in the most difficult circumstances. A professional on the verge of burnout once told me how this practice transformed his relationship with work stress. Each morning, before checking email or starting tasks, he would spend 3 minutes practicing the view from above, mentally zooming out to see his work, his company, and his industry from an ever-expanding perspective. "It completely changed what stressed me out," he explained. "Things that used to keep me up at night now seem so obviously insignificant when viewed from this perspective." There's a beautiful paradox in the Stoic approach to perspective. Thinking about the infinite helps us live better in the finite present. By contemplating cosmic scales of time and space, we don't become detached from everyday life. Rather, we become more fully present to what truly matters within it. As Marcus Aurelius wrote, "Do not act as if you were going to live 10,000 years. Death hangs over you. While you live, while it is in your power, be good." The expanded perspective doesn't lead to disengagement, but to more intentional engagement with what is truly important. This is why the view from above is not an escape from reality, but a more complete embrace of it. We see not just our immediate circumstances, but the larger context in which they exist. This fuller picture allows us to respond with wisdom rather than reactivity. Next time you feel overwhelmed by a problem, take 30 seconds to practice this technique. Visualize yourself rising above your current location, seeing your life from increasingly greater distances. From this perspective, ask yourself, what really matters here? What response would serve my deeper values rather than my immediate reactions? This expanded perspective transforms how you see your problems, but to truly live the Stoic philosophy, we need to understand how to apply it in our relationships with other people. The Stoics discovered a revolutionary principle for dealing with the most difficult behaviors of others, a principle that, when applied, not only transforms your relationships, but eliminates much of the emotional suffering we experience socially. I call this the principle of separation, and in the next chapter I'll show you how it resolves conflicts before they even begin. Have you ever wondered why certain people can push your buttons so easily? That colleague whose every comment seems designed to annoy you? The family member who knows exactly what to say to trigger an emotional response? Or that person on social media whose opinions make your blood boil within seconds? What if there was a way to become virtually immune to provocations, criticism, and difficult behaviors? Not by avoiding these people, but by fundamentally changing how you perceive their actions. When Marcus Aurelius woke each morning, he didn't jump straight into his imperial duties. Instead, he began with a remarkable preparation practice. In his journal, he wrote, "Begin each day by telling yourself, 'Today I shall be meeting with interference, ingratitude, insolence, disloyalty, ill will, and selfishness.'" This wasn't pessimism or misanthropy, it was strategic, emotional preparation. What Marcus understood, and what can transform your relationships today, is what I call the principle of separation. This principle teaches us to distinguish between people's behaviors and their underlying motivations. It's the recognition that harmful actions almost always stem not from malice, but from misunderstanding, fear, or pain. As Marcus wrote elsewhere in his Meditations, "When people injure you, ask yourself what good or harm they thought would come of it. If you understand that, you'll feel no need to be angry or surprised, for you'll either pity or tolerate them, recognizing that they act out of ignorance." This Stoic insight is revolutionary because it directly contradicts our default interpretation. When someone behaves poorly toward us, our automatic reaction is to assume negative intent, that they're deliberately trying to hurt us, disrespect us, or take advantage of us. This interpretation instantly triggers our defensive emotions, anger, resentment, and the desire to retaliate. But the Stoics discovered a profound psychological truth. People rarely act out of pure malice. Instead, they act according to what they believe is right or necessary from their perspective, however flawed that perspective might be. As Epictetus observed, every person acts according to what appears to them to be good. If it appears good to them, it is good. If it appears bad, it is bad. People differ not in their desires, but in their views of what is beneficial. Let's practice applying this principle to a recent conflict. Think of a situation where someone's behavior upset or angered you, perhaps a dismissive comment from a colleague, a friend who didn't follow through on a commitment, or a family member who criticized you unfairly. Got it? Now, instead of focusing on their behavior, ask yourself, what need or belief might have motivated this person? What might they have been trying to achieve, protect, or express? For example, if your colleague dismissed your idea in a meeting, rather than assuming, "They don't respect me," consider that they might be feeling insecure about their own status, anxious about project timelines, or simply operating with different information than you have. This doesn't excuse their behavior, but it does transform how you experience it emotionally. I remember applying this technique during a particularly challenging team conflict. A team member had repeatedly undermined my suggestions in front of others. My initial interpretation was that he was deliberately trying to diminish my contribution and make me look bad. This interpretation naturally generated significant anger and defensiveness. When I applied the principle of separation, I asked myself what need might be driving his behavior. I realized he was likely feeling threatened by changes in the team structure and worried about his role. His undermining behavior wasn't about me personally, it was his misguided attempt to establish security and relevance. Understanding this didn't make his behavior appropriate, but it completely transformed my emotional response and enabled me to address the real issue rather than react to my interpretation. This approach is particularly powerful with difficult colleagues. When someone consistently behaves in ways you find challenging, whether they're constantly complaining, taking credit for others' work, or being overly critical, look beyond the behavior to identify the universal human need driving it. The technique of universal motivation asks, what basic human need might this person be trying to meet through this behavior? All humans share certain fundamental needs for security, autonomy, recognition, meaning, and connection. Problematic behaviors are often misguided attempts to fulfill these legitimate needs. For instance, the colleague who takes credit for others' work isn't necessarily calculating or malicious. They may be desperately seeking recognition and validation that they're not getting elsewhere. The person who micromanages isn't trying to control you out of spite. They're trying to create security in a situation where they feel anxious and responsible. Again, understanding motivation doesn't mean approving of behavior. You can have complete empathy for someone's underlying need, while still maintaining clear boundaries around acceptable actions. As the Stoics taught, we can separate understanding from endorsement. This approach transforms how you handle relationships with those closest to you. When your partner says something hurtful, instead of immediately reacting to the words, apply the principle of separation. Ask yourself, what might they be feeling that prompted this comment? Are they expressing fear, insecurity, or unmet needs through these words? For example, if your partner complains that you never listen, your defensive reaction might be, "That's unfair. I listen all the time." But applying the principle of separation, you might recognize that behind their comment is a legitimate need for connection and understanding. Responding to that need, "It sounds like you're feeling unheard right now. I want to understand what's important to you," rather than defending against the criticism, creates an entirely different conversation. There's a crucial distinction here that's often misunderstood. Comprehending someone's motivation is completely different from approving their behavior. You can fully understand why someone acts as they do while still maintaining clear boundaries about what you will and won't accept. In fact, this understanding often makes it easier to establish boundaries because you can address the underlying need rather than just reacting to the surface behavior. One of the most powerful practices for developing this perspective is what I call practicing generous reasoning. When someone behaves in ways you find difficult, deliberately generate 3 generous explanations for their behavior. These aren't excuses, but plausible alternative interpretations that assume the person is doing their best given their current level of awareness, resources, and circumstances. For instance, if someone is abrupt with you in communication, 3 generous interpretations might be: 1. They're facing pressures I'm unaware of that are limiting their capacity. 2. They may have a different communication style and don't realize how their tone comes across. 3. They might be dealing with personal challenges that have nothing to do with me. This practice doesn't deny the impact of their behavior on you, but it does prevent you from making assumptions about intent that generate unnecessary suffering. As Epictetus taught, it is not events that disturb people, it is their judgments concerning them. Even when someone is deliberately provocative, the principle of separation offers a powerful response strategy. Instead of matching their emotional intensity with your own, you can recognize that their provocation stems from their internal state, not your worth or actions. This recognition creates the space to respond thoughtfully rather than react defensively. When someone deliberately pushes your buttons, pause and ask yourself, what must be going on with this person that they feel the need to behave this way? This simple question creates immediate emotional distance and allows you to respond to their need rather than their tactic. Another powerful Stoic technique for relationship challenges is what I call the reversibility test. Asking yourself, what if I were in their position? Marcus Aurelius practiced this regularly, writing, "When you wake up in the morning, tell yourself, the people I deal with today will be meddling, ungrateful, arrogant, dishonest, jealous, and surly. They are like this because they can't tell good from bad. But I have seen the beauty of good and the ugliness of bad, and have recognized that the wrongdoer has a nature related to my own." This recognition of shared humanity, that under similar circumstances, with similar conditioning, you might act in similar ways, generates natural compassion. It doesn't justify harmful behavior, but it does reduce your reactive judgment and opens possibilities for constructive engagement. Try this exercise now. Think of someone whose behavior you find particularly difficult to understand or accept. For 30 seconds, imagine being completely in their position, with their history, their current challenges, their limited information, their fears, and their hopes. How might their behavior make sense from within their experience? This application of the view from above perspective we discussed earlier is particularly powerful in interpersonal conflicts. When you're in the midst of relationship tension, mentally step back and see both yourself and the other person from a wider perspective. 2 humans, both imperfect, both trying to meet their needs, both capable of growth and understanding. One manager I worked with transformed a toxic team environment using these principles. Instead of seeing difficult team members as obstacles or problems to be managed, he began viewing their challenging behaviors as expressions of unmet needs. The team member who constantly raised objections was seeking security and clarity. The one who dominated discussions was looking for recognition and validation. By addressing these underlying needs directly, creating more structured processes for the security-seeking team member, and acknowledging the contributions of the validation-seeking member before they had to demand attention, the entire team dynamic shifted. Conflicts that had previously consumed hours of emotional energy now resolved quickly or didn't arise at all. What's most remarkable about this approach is that you don't need the other person to change or even participate in the process. By shifting your own perception and response, you transform the relationship unilaterally. As Epictetus taught, make the best use of what is in your power and take the rest as it happens. This principle of separation creates what I call a quiet revolution in your relationships. Without grand confrontations or demands for change, you simply begin responding differently. And because relationships are systems, when you change how you participate in the system, the entire dynamic inevitably shifts. Remember that your change in perspective isn't about letting others off the hook or accepting mistreatment. It's about responding effectively rather than reactively. Sometimes the most appropriate response, viewed from this perspective of understanding, is still to create distance or establish firm boundaries. But you do so from a place of clarity rather than emotional reactivity. As you practice this principle over the next 21 days, you'll discover something remarkable. Behaviors that once triggered strong emotional reactions in you will begin to lose their power. You'll still notice them, but they won't hijack your emotional state or dominate your thoughts. You'll develop what the Stoics considered true freedom, not freedom from challenging people, which is impossible, but freedom in how you respond to them. This principle of separation transforms how you respond to others. But to truly live as the Stoics taught, we need to take one step further and understand how all these practices converge toward a greater goal, not just avoiding suffering, but living with purpose and virtue. In the final chapter, I'll show you how the Stoics integrated all these techniques into a life of deep meaning, what they called living according to nature. It's an approach that solves the fundamental problem many of us face today, the sense that even when things are going well, something essential is still missing. Have you ever achieved a goal that you thought would make you happy, only to find that the satisfaction lasted just a few days? Maybe it was a promotion, a purchase, or even a relationship milestone. You finally got what you wanted, but that deep sense of fulfillment somehow remained elusive. This is one of life's most puzzling paradoxes. We achieve our external goals, but still feel that something essential is missing. This paradox is exactly what the Stoics addressed in their most profound teaching. After exploring how to master our emotional reactions, how to distinguish what we can and cannot control, and how to maintain perspective in challenging situations, we now arrive at the culmination of Stoic practice, what they called living according to nature. But what did the Stoics really mean by this phrase? They weren't suggesting we abandon civilization and live in the forest. The nature they referred to was human nature at its highest potential, a life aligned with virtue, wisdom, and purpose. As Zeno, the founder of Stoicism, put it, the goal of life is to live in agreement with nature. This meant living in accordance with our rational capacity to choose what is good, not just what is immediately pleasant. This understanding solves the paradox of happiness that leaves so many of us confused. Modern culture teaches us to pursue happiness directly, through pleasure, achievement, or acquisition. But as you've likely experienced, this approach consistently fails to deliver lasting satisfaction. The Stoics discovered that happiness is not found by pursuing it directly, but emerges as a byproduct of living virtuously. As Seneca wrote, "The happy life is one that is in accordance with its own nature." This isn't abstract philosophy. It's an incredibly practical approach to finding genuine fulfillment in everyday life. The Stoics identified 4 cardinal virtues that form the foundation of a well-lived life: wisdom, courage, justice, and temperance. Let's understand each one and how they apply to our modern challenges. Wisdom isn't just knowledge. It's the ability to discern what truly matters in any situation. In our information-saturated world, wisdom means knowing which problems deserve your attention and which are better left alone. When you feel overwhelmed by news, social media, and constant notifications, the virtue of wisdom helps you distinguish between what's merely urgent and what's genuinely important. Courage isn't the absence of fear, but acting despite it when something matters. In modern life, courage often means having difficult conversations, setting boundaries, or taking calculated risks. Think about that feedback you've been avoiding giving, or that project you know you should start despite the uncertainty. Courage means moving forward even when your comfort-seeking mind resists. Justice for the Stoics wasn't just about legal matters, but about fairness and integrity in all human relationships. In today's world, justice might mean ensuring your actions align with your values, treating others with respect regardless of status, or contributing to your community in meaningful ways. Temperance is the practice of moderation and self-restraint, knowing when enough is enough. In our culture of constant consumption and stimulation, temperance might mean setting limits on social media, practicing intentional spending, or choosing simplicity over excess. Let's try a practical exercise right now. Take 30 seconds to identify one opportunity in your daily routine where you could practice each of these virtues. Where could you apply more wisdom in your decisions? Where might you need courage? How could you bring more justice to your interactions? Where could temperance serve you better? What makes these virtues so powerful is that they provide clear guidance in any situation. When facing a difficult choice, simply ask, what would a wise, courageous, just, and temperate person do in this situation? This question cuts through confusion and points toward the action that will contribute to genuine flourishing. The Stoics also understood that we play multiple roles in life, each with its own responsibilities. Marcus Aurelius regularly reminded himself of his various roles: as a citizen, a brother, a husband, a father, and an emperor. For each role, he considered what excellence looked like. Try this exercise of roles for yourself. List the key roles you play in your life, perhaps professional roles like employee or entrepreneur, relational roles like friend or parent, and personal roles like student or creator. For each role, define what excellence means. Not perfection, but your honest best expression of virtue within that domain. For example, excellence as a parent might mean being present, patient, and consistent. Excellence as a professional might mean being reliable, innovative, and collaborative. This clarity of purpose within each role provides direction and meaning beyond simply checking tasks off a list. This approach revolutionizes how you make decisions, especially in your career. Many people choose their path based primarily on external metrics, salary, status, or convenience. The Stoic approach inverts this, asking first, which path allows me to best express virtue? This doesn't mean ignoring practical concerns, but it places them in proper perspective. I worked with someone who was choosing between 2 job offers, one with higher pay and status, but in an industry that didn't align with their values, and another with more modest compensation, but meaningful work that contributed to others' well-being. The Stoic framework made the decision surprisingly clear. The role that allowed for greater expression of virtue would ultimately contribute more to their flourishing, regardless of external rewards. This same principle applies to daily choices. When deciding how to spend your evening, what content to consume, or how to respond to a challenging email, the question becomes, which choice best expresses wisdom, courage, justice, and temperance? This clarifies decisions that might otherwise be made based on mere convenience or immediate gratification. A powerful Stoic practice for maintaining this virtuous orientation is what I call the mirror test, a daily self-examination where you honestly assess your actions against your principles. Seneca practiced this each evening, writing, "When the light has been removed and my wife has fallen silent, aware of this habit that's now mine, I examine my entire day and go back over what I've done and said, hiding nothing from myself, passing nothing by." This isn't about harsh self-judgment, but about honest reflection and continuous improvement. Try setting aside 5 minutes before bed to ask, how did I express virtue today? Where might I have fallen short? What will I do differently tomorrow? This practice builds self-awareness and integrity over time. As you develop your Stoic practice, consider creating what I call your internal constitution, a set of personal principles based on the cardinal virtues but tailored to your specific life circumstances. This might include commitments like, I will speak truth even when difficult. I will not sacrifice health for productivity. Or, I will respond to rudeness with understanding rather than retaliation. This internal constitution becomes your compass when navigating complex situations. Unlike rigid rules that break under pressure, principles based on virtue can be applied flexibly to any circumstance while maintaining your integrity. All the practices we've explored throughout this journey work together as an integrated system for living well. The dichotomy of control helps you focus your energy on what you can influence. The premeditatio malorum prepares you for challenges. The perception gap technique gives you space to choose virtuous responses. The journaling protocol helps you process experiences and extract wisdom from them. These aren't separate techniques, but complementary practices that reinforce each other. Together, they form a comprehensive approach to living that the Stoics called eudaimonia, a state of flourishing that comes not from external circumstances, but from living in accordance with virtue. To integrate these practices into your life, I recommend a 30-day plan. For the first 10 days, focus on the dichotomy of control and the perception gap technique. Each morning, identify what you can and cannot control in your day ahead. Throughout the day, practice pausing before responding to triggers. For the next 10 days, add the journaling protocol and the practice of questioning interpretations. Begin and end each day with brief reflection and practice generating alternative perspectives for challenging situations. For the final 10 days, focus on virtue-based decision-making. Before each significant choice, ask yourself which option best expresses wisdom, courage, justice, and temperance. This graduated approach makes the practices manageable while allowing them to build upon each other. Remember that the goal isn't perfection, but progress, becoming incrementally better at living according to your highest nature. I want to be clear about what the Stoics promised and what they didn't. They never claimed that a life of virtue would be free from challenges, losses, or pain. What they offered instead was something far more valuable, a way of living that derives meaning and tranquility not from favorable circumstances, but from your own choices and character. As Marcus Aurelius reminded himself, the impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way. Challenges aren't obstacles to a good life. They are opportunities to express virtue, which is the very substance of a good life. This perspective solves the fundamental problem many of us face in the modern world, the sense that life lacks deeper meaning despite material comfort. When virtue rather than pleasure or achievement becomes your primary aim, every situation, favorable or challenging, becomes an opportunity for meaningful living. A client once told me that after practicing Stoic principles for several months, the greatest change wasn't in his circumstances, but in his experience of them. Before, I was constantly waiting for conditions to be perfect to feel satisfied, he explained. Now I find satisfaction in responding virtuously to whatever conditions I face. This shift, from depending on external circumstances to finding fulfillment in virtuous response, is the essence of Stoic practice. It doesn't promise a life without difficulty, but something far better, a life worth living precisely because of how you navigate difficulty. As you continue your Stoic journey, remember that these practices aren't meant to be academic exercises, but lived experiences. The ancient Stoics weren't writing philosophical treatises for scholars. They were creating practical guides for everyday people facing everyday challenges. As Epictetus emphasized, don't explain your philosophy, embody it. Begin with small applications. When you feel yourself becoming irritated in traffic, practice the dichotomy of control. When a colleague says something hurtful, apply the principle of separation. When facing a difficult decision, ask which choice best expresses virtue. These modest, everyday applications gradually transform your entire relationship with life. I started this journey by talking about emotional freedom, and now you have all the tools the great Stoics used to achieve it. Remember that these aren't just ancient techniques. They're proven practices that work just as well today as they did 2,000 years ago, because human nature remains essentially the same. From now on, you have a choice. Return to automatic patterns of emotional reactivity, or deliberately practice these skills that bring clarity, purpose, and tranquility, regardless of external circumstances. The true test isn't whether you can apply these techniques when things are calm, but whether you can remember them in the heat of the moment. And that's where consistent practice makes all the difference. As Epictetus said, it is not enough to know these things, you must practice them daily. Your Stoic journey doesn't end here. In fact, it's just beginning.